In the last shiur, we discussed when is there a transfer of ownership as far as real estate is concerned. As far as a cash payment for real estate, that we said that even though theoretically the payment of cash really would cause a transfer of ownership of real estate, seeing as everyone in our times is careful that they want to know that the property is going to be registered officially in their names, until this is done, there will be no final transfer of ownership. Okay, that's as far as where payment was made. Today I want to look at a number of other ways. This year, by the way, is Le'il Nishmat Rachel Leah bat Rav Chaim Tzvi. I want to look at a number of other ways that a transfer of ownership can be completed with real estate. Chazal tell us that there are four ways. The first way is payment, which we've already discussed. The second one is a shtar. A shtar is a contract. The third is a chazaka. That would be making improvements in the property. And the fourth way would be a kinyan suda. A kinyan suda is a type of transfer of ownership, which I'm going to have to explain. And now, for the moment, let's just say that there's this fourth way, which is a kinyan suda. We'll explain it later in the shiur Be'ezrat Hashem. Now, the type of contract that our Chazal were discussing when they said that can cause a transfer of ownership with land, with real estate, is not the type of contract that we draw up nowadays. They were talking about a contract where it says, I hereby sell you this piece of land, which is of course explained in the contract which piece of land it is. Then by giving over the contract, when the other person receives the contract, that completes the transfer of ownership. In our times, our contracts are not usually drawn up with that wording. Our contracts are normally an obligation to sell. I hereby promise, I hereby obligate myself that I am going to sell and he is going to pay. That's the normal way that our contracts are written up. So therefore they're not the same, they're not comparable at all to the type of contract that Chazal were talking about. As we mentioned before, a promise to sell is a promise. It's an obligation that you have to keep, but it does not cause a change of ownership. So therefore our contracts do not cause a change of ownership. They're an obligation to sell. They set out all the details of the sale, what's included in the sale, what's not included in the sale, but they themselves, the giving over or the exchanging of contracts, will not cause a change of ownership unless they have the special wording that Chazal used, that I hereby, with the giving over of this contract, transfer ownership. The third way we spoke, money, the contract, is a chazakah. A chazaka. A kinyan chazaka means making improvements to the property. Three types of improvements are considered a sign of ownership. Because again, if we go back to the overriding principle with all acquisitions, it's where there's a meeting of minds, where there's a final decision that we want now for there to be a transfer of ownership. So normally, where the seller is going to allow the buyer to already start making improvements to the property, knocking down fences, changing locks, putting a new front door in, things like that you don't do unless you plan on already giving him over the ownership. So therefore, even though you didn't say that you're not planning on giving over ownership with such a thing, where these things were done, they would be considered that there's already been a transfer of ownership. This means you have to be very, very careful if someone's, let's say, selling their house, that not to let the buyer start doing improvements in the property before you're ready for there to be a final transfer of ownership. Because any outstanding debt he has, any monies he hasn't yet paid for the flat, will now become a debt, and the transfer of ownership has already been made. Now go and collect your debt. sometimes it might not be so easy to collect your debt. So, therefore, even though the conditions of payment are set out in the contract, if you let the buyer move in, or even not move in, just start doing substantial improvements to the property that would be considered as improvements that you wouldn't let someone do unless you're planning on making it, unless there's a new owner, then you have to be very, very careful. Now, even though the terms of payment were stated in the contract, if you let those dates pass and you don't make an immediate claim for payment, then we would say that you can see that the payment is not actually an overriding condition, that without that you're not prepared to transfer ownership. If you let him make